Hi, my name is Madeline Snyder, and today myself and my partner Alexa Potts will be discussing a case study of the World Trade Center attack, which took place on September 11th, 2001. First, I just wanted to bring it to your attention that you might actually remember the events that took place on 9/11, where you were at the time, how the information was communicated with you, how you responded, and years later, how you've grown as a result of your experience of the event. Personally, I was a sophomore in high school, sitting in my arts class during first period when an announcement disrupted the daily flow of things. The classroom television flickered on, and we were suddenly consumed and raptured by the terror taking place. The general response in the room was utter shock, concern, and helplessness. And actions were taken, including contacting relatives in New York City to ensure that they were safe. Over the next several months, conversations about what to do in such a situation took place at home, which for me was in a northern Chicago suburb. At the same time that we came to grips with the realities of what had taken place on 9/11, there was a mentality of never again that was definitely national. This was my own experience, which I think really illustrates how such disaster can be prepared for and responded to on a small, very individual scale. Um, and now we're going to shift our lens to a bigger multi-level perspective where we'll be evaluating the bigger picture of things by reviewing how the city of New York and the state for that part and its partner states nearby prepared for and responded to the attacks of 9/11. So first I'd like to start off by sharing a quote by our former president, George W. Bush. So he says that terrorist attacks can shake the foundations of our biggest buildings, but they cannot touch the foundation of America. These acts shatter steel, but they cannot dent the steel of American resolve. And I think that particular quote really resonates with that never again type of mentality that most communities across the nation shared. So, before we begin, I just wanted to share a little bit of information on the background of terrorism in the US up until that point. So, since the Clinton administration, the US had been aware of a potential threat such as that which ended up unfolding on 9/11. However, there were a lot of failures at the federal level that occurred in preventing this event. So, as I mentioned, there was definitely a known animosity towards the U.S. by this terrorist group in the Middle East called Al Qaeda, and they actually were responsible for some U.S. embassy bombs in the 1990s. But instead of the U.S. government going in and having a very, I guess, proactive response, there were a couple shortcomings. For example, here you see that there really wasn't any national intelligence estimate on terrorism between 1995 and 2011. And there were also a number of counterterrorism efforts that really failed against international terrorist organizations. And lastly, immigration actually wasn't really like what it is today, a very hot national security issue. So those are some things that we knew about, but we didn't necessarily take the best actions to prevent on a national level by the government. So again, as I mentioned, the events that took place on 9/11 were responsible by a group called Al Qaeda, which was an extremist political group originating from the Middle East, primarily Saudi Arabia. And specifically 19 of its members were responsible for all of the attacks that took place on September 11th. Here, this graphic illustrates each of the four distinctively different attacks that each used a US plane to execute. So at the very top, you actually see the first two planes that were involved in the attacks on the World Trade Center buildings, which were in a part of Lower Manhattan in New York City. And then you see two others, which involve the Pentagon, and as well as another that crashed outside of Pittsburgh. So specifically, I'd like to draw your attention to the fact that relating to the World Trade Center attacks, which is what we will be focusing on, there were more than 3,000 deaths, including the largest numbers being those of firefighters and emergency responders in New York City alone. And more than 10,000 people were injured. with only 6 survivors of those originally located inside World Trade Center prior to their destruction. So this attack on those 2 buildings in and about themselves was extreme and effective per the intentions of the hijackers, unfortunately. So there were a number of different agencies that responded in New York to the World Trade Center attacks. So this includes the New York Fire Department, and then the New York Police Department, as well as their Special Operations Division and their Emergency Service Unit, the Port Authority Police Department, the New York City, the New York Department of Health, which really took a large role in coordinating a multi-agency effort to respond to the events, the Greater New York Hospital Association, which responded to the enormous surge of demand, and lastly, the Mayor's Office of Emergency Management and Interagency Preparedness. And you can see at the top that the fire department actually responded within 5 minutes of the attack, and all of the different agents within the mayor's office, and these were actually dispatches they actually dispatched notifications to the fire department as well as the police department, Department of Health, and Great Hospital Association within 3 minutes of the attack. So there were a lot of different communications coming in, but there was an intent to have a coordinated, cohesive effort in response. So, as you can imagine, an event such as this had a very robust involvement of public health. So what it did do was about 30 minutes after the first plane crashed into the World Trade Center, which roughly occurred around 8:43, I believe, the Public Health Department responded, and that actually occurred about an hour before that first tower fell. And then the New York Department of Health had an emergency response infrastructure that I did mention previously that was in place and established based on public health principles and incorporated several key elements related to the incident command system framework. And so, as you can see, that in relation to that, there were responses were rehearsed, and there were a number of different mechanisms within the plans that enabled them to respond, specifically communication, training, different medical utilities, and so forth. And actually, it was so effective that within the first few hours, evacuations were actually successful of the buildings and Lower Manhattan. Still, while 9/11 and the attacks on the World Trade Center yielded what might appear to be a timely response, it really revealed a couple issues with public health's role in an emergency response, and highlighted a need for continual improvement for medical and hospital-based emergency response systems. So the casualty count can actually be illustrated by terms of where the planes impacted both the north and south towers. So casualties that were nearly 100% of those that occupied the impact zone and above the impact zone. And then those below that zone, actually only approximately 100 people below that zone ended up losing their lives. And on the positive side, that was really due to the hard work of the emergency responders. So there, like as I mentioned earlier, there were a couple different preventative measures that could have been put into place by the U.S. government that may have aided in the prevention of this type of attack. Some that I thought really stood out to me in my research were the fact that they didn't really recommend passports that were manipulated and a fraudulent behavior. Additionally, they didn't, in terms of the plane's design, it made it somewhat accessible for a hijacker to implement a plan of accessing the cockpit. So, those are two things that could have been regulated by the U.S. government, or even, through the means of the National Transportation Services or immigration. So options definitely occurred as a result of that. But in terms of operational preparedness failures, I think the two largest were, overall, there were so many different agents responding to this tremendous event, and unfortunately, they weren't really able to successfully execute a unified incident command system. So that ended up in a lot of redundant communications, and a lot of issues that may have been prevented had there been more cohesion amongst the different agencies responding. And I guess to dovetail off that, as a result, there were really inadequate communications among all of the emergency responders. So with that, I'm actually going to go ahead and pass the proverbial YouTube baton over to my partner, Alexa Potts.